let's move on to the Anglo-American Loan,
Yeah.
which was organised on the 15th of July 1946. So we sent the economist John Maynard Keynes, yes, the insufferable one, to negotiate, despite being on death's door. I wonder why we had a bad deal. Because Britain was effectively bankrupt and needed to continue rebuilding the country and to repay the Lend-Lease loans and the World War I loans as well. So we'd racked up loads and loads of loans to the United States. The loan was for 3.75 billion at a much lower interest rate, a 2% interest rate. And also Canada loaned an additional 1.19 billion as well to us to help us repay these loans and rebuild our economy. There was, of course, a clause that we had to repay in US dollars, which they clearly hadn't learnt from the first time. So yes, we basically cleaned out our colonies and destroyed the British Empire to have to pay for this, which is why from post-World War II, there was this massive decline, as you probably well know, and we slowly, gradually lost all of our colonies around the world to the point now where we have very few. We've got a few remote islands in the ocean because we had to pay for all these debts and couldn't maintain them.
Well, we just call it the Commonwealth,
yes,
don't we? Where you're invited to join the Commonwealth if you wanted to, and quite a lot of them said no thanks. But quite a lot of them
ultimate
didn't.
insult. They're just like, nah.
Well, like Canada and Australia, they're like, well, yeah, of course it's going to be better to be a type of bloc like that. But many of the places, like India, say, and Pakistan and Bangladesh, we're like, yeah, no thanks. We can go our own way, absolutely. But then, I mean, the Commonwealth, there are quite a few countries in the Commonwealth, isn't it? Because now they're sort of called overseas protectorates and things, aren't they? Like tiny little islands, like St Kitts or something.
They have some sort of strategic value to them in that we can set up bases for the Navy and things like that, but it's pretty negligible now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny, actually, though, having said that, just super quick, because I know we've got to crack on, but things like just still having a massive air base on Cyprus or still holding Gibraltar. Little things here and there, really key choke points around the world. You'll still find a Royal Navy base there or an RAF base there. Or like America. Really, really remote islands in the Pacific or something. But actually, in sort of world geopolitics, it's important to, well, make the argument, it's important to have a presence there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, I mean, there's not that many countries that have got aircraft carriers, not many at all, because you're able to project your power around the world if you have an aircraft carrier, aren't you? Well, Britain's still got a couple, haven't we? And there's literally only a handful of nations that have got them.
But yes, it's safe to say that after the Anglo-American Loan, Britain stopped being the dominant country in the world. And I think that this is the point where America takes over, really.
Well, if we go on post-war, we must go back and at least say a couple of lines, at least reference, pardon me, I do apologise, the Bretton Woods Conference, because that's 1944. The war hadn't
I am
finished,
going to get onto that, don't worry.
Okay.
I'm just doing it slightly out of chronology.
Sorry.
If you'll humour that.
I will do, no, go ahead. Okay.
I was going to talk about the Marshall Plan, and then I was going to move on to Bretton Woods.
Okay.
As obviously Bretton Woods is 1944, so it's actually before the war has ended, but I would argue that I've got like a subsection called Creating Hegemony.
Okay.
And I think that this is part of that, whereas this is all stuff to do with loans. So the Marshall Plan, which was 1948, was injected another 13 billion, the equivalent to 115 billion in 2021, into lots of European countries. So obviously most European cities were destroyed, many nations had their economies in tatters, and the prospect of famine was actually quite a real one, particularly in Germany as well, I would say. The Soviets had also expanded to most parts of Eastern Europe, and Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the European nations create a plan for their reconstruction, and the US would basically bankroll it. And publicly, obviously, it was about rebuilding their allies, as well as ensuring we develop liberal democracies so we don't have another world war. We'd already had two. We're kind of sick of them at that point, as an understatement. Obviously, Britain didn't need to develop a liberal democracy because we already had one, so obviously that part of it was somewhat exempt. some economists actually dispute that this plan was even warranted in the first place, because by 1948, many countries were already on the right track to recovery just on their own. And many people who I at least believe are reputable suggest that it was more about pumping US dollars into Europe so they could have an export market here for their goods, because of course the destruction of the world economy in World War II, and they have this massive industrial capacity that no one's buying. They're building their own cities again, and therefore if you pump money in there, you're going to get a better return. It's like an investment, really.
Yeah.
And
or just like a gangster, the VIG, the interest you charge on something. Yeah, I'm happy to lend you money. Because I'm going to wring more out of you than I ever gave you in the first place. So, yeah, it's just, the money racket.
So, by 1952, the economic growth in countries that had received funds surpassed pre-war levels. So, at least it seemed to work in terms of economic development and accelerating it. Also, this is something that gets overlooked, 5% of funds went towards the CIA, who established front businesses in many European countries to further the US's aims, which ties in quite nicely to establishing their hegemony, because of course no country would agree to these sorts of things.
Like United Fruit or something.
Yeah, well, what they did was they financing such as anti-communist propaganda, and you get cases of fake newspapers in Eastern Germany bankrolled by the US and things like that. So I'm not obviously going to complain about anti-communist activities, and they also funded insurgents in Ukraine, which of course was a Soviet satellite state at the time. So, you know, although I'm all for defunding the CIA, in this case, I kind of agree with what they were doing. It's anti-Soviet stuff, which of course spells the start of the Cold War, which I will briefly go over as well, because of course by that point the Americans were resoundingly the dominant country. But on to Bretton Woods.
Well, so that was the thing I was going to say. So again, this is a thing lots of historians argue about. When exactly did America become the sort of at least one of the two superpowers? And different historians argue, and some say it's between the wars, something like that. But a lot say it was Bretton Woods. It was when the Bretton Woods conference broke up. It's like a place, a hotel in New Hampshire.
It is, yeah. Right. It was a town, I believe. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I think a lot of them stayed in a couple of specific, or the main delegates stayed in a couple of specific hotels. But anyways, that once that broke up and everything was sort of going America's way, at that point you can say the writings on the wall for the British Empire or anyone else.
If you had to put a pinpoint in time, right, I could certainly agree with that, yeah.
Yeah. And historians love to do that, don't they? If they can. This year or even this day is when everything changed. But yeah,
it's very arbitrary, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, yes, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 saw delegates from 44 countries meet at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as you said. The goal was to create an efficient foreign exchange system, prevent competitive devaluations of currency, and to promote international economic growth. So what the agreement actually was that gold was the basis for the US dollar's value, and other currencies were pegged to the US dollar. So it basically tied all world currency to the US dollar, which we still more or less have today, although it is worth mentioning that in the 70s, Nixon abolished the gold standard. So the dollar isn't even based on any value, it's just based on whatever the federal government wants it to be. So that's even further removed from any objective value. So they also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both ideas proposed by the US Treasury Department, and both, generally speaking, are directly or indirectly working in the interests of the United States' hegemony. So this is how they maintain it, and these are just means of managing international development and finance, so international loans, things like that. But it's more or less a formal extension of what the US was doing in World War I and World War II in loaning out money. And it's more or less crystallising the US's influence, isn't it?
Yeah, if you're going to be unkind, you could just call it dollar imperialism.
Yeah,
they won't have an empire like the British Empire, which was a much more old school empire, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, well,
in the mould of even medieval ancient empires to some degree, whereas dollar imperialism is we don't have to necessarily have tank divisions or infantry divisions in your country. You just owe us all your money. It's just a thing like, I think at the end of World War II, all the gold reserves, 2/3 of the entire world's gold was held by America.
I can certainly believe that, yeah.
And people say the Bretton Woods monetary system, if you want to call it that, runs from sort of 44 to when Nixon ended the gold standard in 71 or something. So that whole window there, America is on paper. There's no way to deny that they're just the money masters of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the IMF or the World Bank, if you're going to be kind to it, you can say, well, they're just helping the world's poorest to drag themselves out of poverty. If you want to be unkind, you can say, well, they're just making them indebted to the American hegemony. Doesn't have to even be New York financiers or anything like, you know. So there's some examples, I think, from later in the century, sort of even the 80s and 90s, where some of the smaller countries, more poorer countries in Southeast Asia, the IMF, like Indonesia or something, I might be wrong about that, but the IMF would go, or the World Bank would go to them and say, look, we'll give you billions of dollars so you can have an industry. You don't have to have most of your country impoverished villages where kids have got no shoes and people haven't got clean water and everything. And they'll say, no, thanks. We don't want your poison chalice. No, because it means forevermore we will constantly be owing you all our resources, effectively, in some way.
Definitely.
So yeah, again, these things that seem like sort of altruistic kindness to make the rest of the world less poor, actually is some sort of money racket to make sure you can never be truly free.
Well, one of the best ways
Both of those are extremes. I'm not sure how much I agree with those, but that's just. But
to be fair,
of it.
One of the best ways to pursue your own self-interest is to present it as some sort of altruistic virtue, isn't it?
Yeah, sneaky. Yeah, tricky. Yeah.
So moving on to the Cold War, obviously America is the dominant country in the world. They founded NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in Washington, D.C., just to, make it explicit, which is an alliance of European and American states against the Soviet Union. So at this point, yes, America is leading the allies against the Soviet Union, who are clearly the weaker power. People say that, yes, the Soviet threat, they had nuclear weapons, that's true. However, their capacity was not nearly that of America's, and with all of the allied states as well, if it came to it just on a war of economies alone, the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to survive. And of course, in 1991, it collapsed. Of course, it's also worth mentioning as well that NATO's chief military officer is traditionally an American, which is, of course, a very important position. And just to really emphasise in finishing up just how dominant the United States was in the Cold War, these are all of the countries in which the United States had direct programs to have regime change: China, Greece, Costa Rica, Albania, Burma, the Philippines, Paraguay, Indonesia, Syria, Egypt, Cuba, South Korea, Iran, Guatemala, South Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Angola, Argentina, Afghanistan, Poland, Chad, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, and Lebanon. And these are just the ones we know about.
Yeah. There's two brothers, John Foster Dulles and his little brother, Alan Dulles, who, between them, this is more in the age of the time of Eisenhower, so the 50s, post-war 50s sort of time, straight after the war in the 50s kind of times. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State, so like the Foreign Secretary, effectively, and Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA. So between them, they controlled the official and secret foreign policy of America, and they were completely of the same mind, it seemed. They never certainly openly, never disagreed with each other. Their view of the world was almost completely in lockstep with each other. So between them, John Foster Dulles died before Alan Dulles. So between them, they're really not entirely, it's obviously reality is much more complicated than that, but between them, they're responsible, and that Ike signed off on it all, particularly in the 50s. This sort of going around the world, really, and anywhere in the world, really, to thwart communism and or shore up American influence, both the carrot and the stick. Like, take our money, please. And if you don't, we'll subvert you inside out, and your leadership will be gone one way or another. So play ball. The Dulles brothers would be worth looking into if anyone wants to sort of do a bit of reading or research of their own on that.
But certainly by this point, America as the dominant country, it's completely undeniable, isn't it? I mean, the proof is in the pudding and what they're able to do. And hopefully that's a good picture of how America became the most powerful country in the world.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.